Ну, мир будет тогда, когда мы достигнем своих целей, о которых вы сказали.
Победа! Победа будет за нами!
If that's the case, if we don't support Ukraine, then Putin wins. But Putin will not stop in Ukraine.
So it's Europe's biggest conflict. Since World War II has begun to appear the first signs of the end. A perspective no Western power wants it, also taken into account in the context that the opponent is entangled in internal turf. That's President Putin's army. To win a strategic victory on the Ukrainian battlefield. But even when that happens, should Russia celebrate? And the United States, the world's most powerful country, what was prepared for the situation? There's obviously a possibility of this happening. Let's find the answer in today's video. Even though the difference is beneficial, but really, war can't predict anything. Especially in a big war as complicated as the current conflict in Ukraine. What is strategic victory? Military historians and scientists often refer to this concept to talk about one or a series of tactical victories. Over there, accomplish the real goal of the entire campaign. However, in special cases, a tactical failure is a strategic victory, as in the case of losing a battle, but they do damage to the enemy, to the point of no recovery. It's called a Pyrrhic victory. In other words, countries with large resources. It's often accompanied by the ability to organize logistics. It's easy to bring the enemy in. More Pyrrhic victory, based on the superior resilience of the enemy. After every defeat, to confirm that one side is at war, they won the strategy or not. We can base it on the war goals of each side. Accomplishes his war goal. It's the winning side. The most compelling evidence is one side must give in almost all of the unequal conditions given by the enemy, or there's a side that's suffering to the point of no recovery. Relate strength to the enemy like before the war. Now let's look at Russia's war goals. As far as we know so far, it's two basic points. The first, the 4 regions annexed to Russia: Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. Second, change the current Ukrainian government according to the will of Russia. So in this video, let's go into assumptions. Russia scored at least one of the 2 points, and regardless of the circumstances, they claim victory by changing the target or swapping change loss to win at the negotiating table. First, we'll come to the case that any of you would love. Russia and President Putin love it. That's the military. Russia just ousted the Zelensky government. We've just secured 4 annexation zones. When you get to that point, of course, Russia will succeed. Great influence on an area. It was an important republic, second after Russia in the Soviet Union. They can also deploy large numbers of weapons, put serious pressure on NATO's strongest line of defense. Maybe you don't know, Russia and Ukraine, they are, in turn, the largest wheat exporters, the 5th largest in the world, accounts for about 25% to 30% of global wheat supply. Ukraine is also a sovereign country. Large abundant resource reserves can be told. Among them as coal gas mainly in the east. The 4 regions controlled by Russia are lithium, titanium, iron, and African kim. Many companies in Europe, China, and Russia used to be very competitive to gain access to these resources in Ukraine. The imposition of influence on Ukraine, it also allows Russia to unleash its power on the world that are no longer constrained because seaports are as prone to freezing as they used to be. It's not just a strategic location. Putin can't just use crude oil, gas that even wheat can be weaponized. the Russian economy after a long period of weakness. There is also an opportunity to recover strong growth as long as they don't have self-destruct phases going into people's hearts. Like the 1990s, Russia's position relative to its partners, like India, China, it is also significantly elevated as a total force. It's a big part of the supply chain. It doesn't just stop at the level. It's a strategic resource provider, current defense products. The strong growth of the economy will form a series of chain reactions, help Russia improve its military capabilities. The big projects in the incubation of the world's largest country, it can become a reality. The most impressive among them, let's talk about the nuclear aircraft carrier project. Lemanton has a displacement of 40 per thousand to 100,000 T. It can carry up to 40 aircraft like the MiG-29K, in addition to the older aircraft carriers, the kind of Kuznetsov that China has. It can also be purchased or closed to add strength to the Navy. It is not equivalent to the US, but it's also possible to strengthen our national position, especially in the areas around Venezuela, Iran, and possibly Cuba. Even though it's too far away, if you don't want to say it's impossible for a position like the Soviet Union before Kier, but at least the growth of the economy, as well as new strategic locations, allowing the world's largest country put pressure on NATO countries, Europe. The strong rise of Russia will force European countries for a long time don't want to fall into the struggle. With powers such as Serbia must consider offering to side with Russia-Belarus. A U.S. military counterweight in Europe officially formed, with China in Asia as a counterweight to the United States across the ocean. For neighboring countries, there's a very high level of unfriendliness with Russia. In Europe, it's like Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Finland. If they don't change their attitude about the world's largest country, it's obviously going to be under a lot of pressure. That comes from the root causes of historical problems. Finland, Poland, or the Baltic states, even if it's a neighbor, but there's always a tendency to stay away from Russia's sphere of influence. A year after the conflict in Ukraine, Latvia, on January 23, 2023, announced the downgrade of diplomatic relations with Russia down to the Chargé affairs. They are also promoters, Germany and many NATO countries, sending more weapons to help Kiev gain an advantage in the war with Russia. December 20th, Prime Ministers of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania released a joint statement. The countries will adopt a common approach in the implementation of sanctions of the European Union for Russia and Belarus from January 31st, 2024. In Lithuania just now, people have seen the effort. Latvian as the only language used in schools. The plan is expected to be completed by 2025, in spite of the opinion of unexperts, is that it's possible to violate the discrimination ban for Russian-speaking ethnic minority groups. However, some people agree with the government's actions. Lithuania believes that the policy of imposing the language of the majority for school and administrative, it's the usual way for a country to assert its sovereignty. This has been done in most countries today. That's why Moscow uses discrimination as a reason, Russian to put pressure on countries like Monaco, or before that Ukraine. Accidentally done. That's why the government has attracted support, especially the far right. So don't be surprised if Russia wins in Ukraine. They're going to carry out siege plans, imposing sanctions on unfriendly groups, despite the uncompromising attitude of the enemy. In Russia's Baltic neighbors, the story of a Russian attack, it has also been proposed, but with so little potential, it's hard to believe they'll survive, even if only for a short time, in front of the Russian army, but only a little. We won't have to worry too much about the situation. Russia will launch a military operation, especially in these countries, even names that used to belong to the former Soviet Union, even though we are deeply divided, but the gritty heads of NATO's leaders. It can't be ignored either. The year of NATO, it's the soul of the whole thing, to protect the position of all members. Yourself, Russia is not so desperate as to risk having nothing to lose. they also know the consequences will be irreversible if we rush to attack NATO countries. Article 5 of NATO cannot be ignored to protect all members of the group. Because the greater the power, the greater the responsibility that the burden of protecting the weak will be heavy. The United States is next in line with the bloc's dominant position, like England, Germany, France. The US alone had to deploy military forces. It could be tens of thousands of people to protect the small Baltic states. Even in a short time, maintaining such a status quo, it's still not that difficult for countries that belong to the great powers. But in the long run, it's hard to believe the idea. Strong water, unconditional weak water protection is possible, especially with Western institutional-style countries. When it comes to using people's tax dollars to destroy, always mentioned as a way to attract votes. And of course, use your own money to protect national security. Because of NATO, the EU is a macro country. It's hard to get sympathy from the masses. In Germany, many experts are concerned Russia's victory will make their trade position globally complete collapse. Then Russia will stimulate. Extremists and populists take advantage of this opportunity. But of course, we can't help but take into account in the case of these countries, because some event will turn into wartime mode. Risk of another conflict breaking out on the old continent. Across the ocean, the US may have to choose to allocate resources between maintaining a military presence in Asia, Pacific Ocean, or deploy to Europe to support our allies in the face of any Russian moves. No matter what, NATO has also lost its credibility and faced the most serious challenge since the breakup of the Soviet Union. On the opposite side, Russia also did not miss the opportunity to gradually disperse resources, weakening the world's most powerful power today, push the US out of Europe. Yes, to put it simply, is that they continue to engage more closely with China on the basis of a better relationship, both allies between the two countries at the present time. As you know, America's strategic ally, it's not just NATO members in Europe, but also Japan, South Korea in Asia, in a long-term confrontation with China. Both countries have conflicting interests with the West. That's America's Japanese ally. Both have bitter disputes with Russia and China. In the present moment, China has emerged as a comprehensive counterweight to the United States, not as strong as the Soviet Union before, but China itself has more subtle measures that the US cannot draw the line. Russia is the best choice after winning the victory in Ukraine. In the context of isolation from the West, is still dependent on the supply of consumer goods, China's complex electronic components. Russia also needs a country of billions. Take the burden to undermine the United States and Japan by supporting or ignore China's territorial claims with neighboring countries like Japan, Korea, and India. They also support China. There's been a tough move in Taiwan, South China Sea, and East China Sea. It's also likely to become more active with the brawls between the two most powerful forces on the planet. Just like that, for the first time in my not-so-long history, United States and Western Europe, you will face the risk of losing your position. Are the rulers of the present world. The US cannot wage war in the form of an arms provocation. Like today, we need to be more serious because they no longer hold absolute power. It's not just a huge benefit for China. According to analysts, the Russians will not miss the opportunity to attract new allies in Africa and Latin America. Some analysis shows that it's not just the West, that many other countries have territorial disputes. He also expressed concern that Putin's success, it will inspire nations, are considering invasion of the territories of neighboring countries. Indeed, throughout history, the territory of most of the countries that have the present, it's all shaped by the process of expansion, narrow through the war, individual, as in the case you're seeing above screen. Policy. Since the time of the Soviet Union, parts of these two countries have fallen into a state of overlap. It's also the source of their persistent conflict for several decades now, since the breakup of the Soviet Union. In Africa, where the influence of tribal culture, The clans are still very strong. Ethnic conflict is still going on quietly every day, and it's hard to imagine how it's going to be if disgruntled forces are fully armed. Food. Reclaiming the historic land is a very old reason, but it makes perfect sense for a force to conduct conflicts. Russians can take the opportunity. The West is confused by these uncertainties to fill the void in Africa, Central Asia, to draw the emerging powers to their side. An important turning point in his plan to dominate the world, according to the principle, the enemy of the enemy is you. New forces in poor African countries are struggling with the rulers, living a life of luxury. With the West's enormous debt, it would be difficult to refuse an offer of assistance from Russia. Right in the present moment, Russia is beneficial, but they haven't been able to deliver any definitive blows on Ukraine. They've started to make their first moves to oust the West from Africa. We could also see before of the banner force in Africa. July 27th to 28th, the summit in St. Petersburg. It marks an important turning point in strategy to mobilize Russia's support from groups of developing countries in Africa. For a poor Africa, all they need right now is food, medicine, and energy. And Russia has a lot of that. The meeting in St. Petersburg was also let Russia express understanding of the difficulties of Africa. It doesn't just stop at increasing food supply for Africa. That's 3 times more than the same period in 2022. The Russian side also announced, we want to support Africa in healthcare, education, technology, and energy. Russia has not forgotten. Navigate the participating African countries. Russia's de-dollarization trajectory, based on the 2 initial objectives, to reduce the possibility of misunderstanding and enlist the sympathy of African leaders. Mr. Putin has gradually mobilized African countries to join system for the transfer of trade transactions between Russia, Africa, to its native currencies, including the Russian ruble. So we can predict that, after being hands-free in Europe with NATO anxiety, with Russian assistance for ambitious countries in Africa, it will get bigger, continue to undermine American and Western influence. But what if Russia wins? It's not very complete. For those of you who've played the second minute of the video, in this case, we will consider Russia completely gains for eastern regions, but failed to overthrow the hostile Kiev regime. This would require at least a ceasefire from both sides. Ukraine will not agree to recognize 4 new regions annexed by Russia. The arms race in Eastern Europe. That's why it gets stressful. The Kiev government can take advantage of the pain of losing territory to turn the accusations of militarization from the Russian side become a reality. So for Russia, things won't change much, except for they're going to have to continue the arms race. Concentrate your forces to the west to prevent the risk of destructive incursions from Ukraine, or the risk of rebellion from pro-Kiev forces. If the arms race becomes more intense, Russia could step up its support to countries like Iran and North Korea. The result would be a new proliferation of nuclear weapons. At the end of that period, there may be 15 or more nuclear powers, instead of the current 9 powers. This will increase the risk of miscalculation and the possibility of technical failure. But even so, it's also a big Russian victory. That's also the moment. Who yearn for a new world? Russia is one of the great aspirations. The West will lose its credibility as a guarantor of stability, security, and order. The subject of nationalism, rethinking the current world as China-Russia. Iran and other countries, together with their allies, will rise up. So there's a new international order. It's starting to form. The universality of human rights. Western style will be relativized. States are concentrated. Power will be consolidated globally. Values of the West, it's the norm in many places, will be weakened around the world. The lives of developed countries in Europe will be uneasy, poorer, and more lonely. Above are the predictions about what Russia will do after the victory. Really the trend. New powers seeking to overthrow the world order are holding themselves back to create a new pole in my favor. It's always been part of the flow of human history. A trend in favor of a new dominant power. It could also be a turning point for human development, or it could be a step back that only the future can answer. But that anyway, these are the comments of 5 Seconds Unfiltered, based on the documents that we've collected from both Russia and the West. So according to you, is there anything that Russia will do after the victory in Ukraine that we haven't mentioned or not? Leave it at the bottom of the comments section. And now and see you. Have a nice day with your family.